And we are live. Take it away, Susan.
All right. Thank you, Sunday. Welcome, everyone. This is our week 3 of our digital citizenship series. We're excited this week to talk about the Publics. And in the blog post, I prompted everyone with a series of questions that we're going to dive into deeply today. But first off, I want to do some introductions, and I'll actually start with myself. I'm Susan Adams, and I'm a senior instructional designer at Oregon Health and Science University. And I've invited a few guests today to join us for this discussion, and why don't we go ahead and start with Autumn.
Hi, I'm Autumn Keynes, and I am here in Columbus, Ohio in the United States, and I'm going to be kind of watching Twitter a little bit, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited. We had a Twitter chat yesterday, which was really interesting. A lot of good things came up, and I'm excited to talk in a more synchronous, kind of real-time with faces and voices kind of way. So thank you for everybody for having me.
Great. And how about you, Chris?
Okay, I'm Chris Gilliard. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, where I am right now. And I kind of did the last week of the digital citizenship gig. And so I'm excited to be here and looking forward to mainly just hearing what everyone else has to say.
Thanks, Chris. And Kate.
Okay, I'm Kate Bowles. I'm here joining from Australia. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's lovely to see people that I know and to be part of this. I saw the last 10 minutes of the Twitter chat yesterday, and I think this is a very timely, timely moment to have this conversation.
Great, thank you, Kate. And Rebecca.
Okay, I'm Rebecca Hogue. I live in Sunnyvale, California, but I'm currently in Ottawa, Canada, so I'm joining you from Canada this time. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa and an instructional designer at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So it's just kind of amusing because I'm very digitally, I guess, professional since I live on one coast of North America and I teach and study on the other coast.
That's great. Thanks, Rebecca. And Sunday.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sunday, and I'm currently in Wisconsin. I work at St. Norbert College, and every once in a while you'll see Beast. That's the cat who's blocking my face. He really is really interested in digital citizenship, I guess.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really, in many ways, new to this subject and have just felt nothing but a welcome from the community surrounding digital pedagogy and ultimately this conversation. So for me, it's been an extraordinary experience to have that welcome be so warm. And invited me in many ways to take the risks that I feel like are risks for me personally to show myself on the internet in the ways that I am now. I don't think I personally would have felt comfortable with that had I not been able to see or almost have some modeling from some of you that are right here in the conversation, but also just in general, the contributions and the generosity of anyone that contributes their ideas, whether they're provocative or whether they're supportive. I don't even know what opposite of provocative would be. So I started at that space of being really optimistic, and now I'm moving deeper into some, I don't know if I want to say consequences, but a need for me to educate myself and to get more in depth to the understanding of the full spectrum of possibility to engaging in online networks. So I'm really recognizing that there's a privilege that I have and the responsibility I want to take therein. But I'm also just really interested in having this conversation with individuals now to understand the edges that we all play in how we both declare ourselves online and also contribute online. So I just wanted to give a little background to sort of how I've gotten to the conversation and how I've begun to craft these questions for myself, and why this conversation is so salient for me. And I want to just remark on Kate's comment in her introduction that this is a really imperative time for us to be present to what is at play in our world. And we have an opportunity to provide containers for not only learning, but also for what I would call critical conversations across many, many, many divides. And how can we do that well? So I think that that's a part of it for me that got sparked and inspired by Kate's brief comment there. So that I would love to dive into as well. One of the first questions that we got into in the Twitter chat tomorrow that I think I can sort of start with, but also welcome people to simply respond to what I just said, is when you declare your digital identity, almost even when you began to do that, or when you're simply declaring even now in your time spectrum online, what responsibilities, if any, do you assume for yourself and that happens for you in that declaration and participation? I'll start with that. And welcome, George.
Oh, hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll go back on mute. I apologize for being late. I think I let Susan know that I was going to be in another meeting, but I just escaped. So.
Yeah, well, welcome, George. Why don't you introduce yourself and where you're from?
Okay, I'm George Station. I'm a lecturer at Cal State Monterey Bay, and I teach first-year students. I teach a first-year seminar with the theme Technology and Society, and it meets a social science general education requirement at Cal State Monterey Bay.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us today. All right. So anyone can jump in based on that prompt and join in.
I wonder if I could sort of say a little about why it was that I made the comment. Sorry, Rebecca, I spoke over you there. It's a particular joy for me to see Rebecca here, so we have all sorts of contacts. The reason I made that comment is that I think this is a very rough time in the world for actual citizenship. Many of us have become acutely aware of our citizenship because either governments or other state authorities, as you're experiencing in the US, are doing things in the name of the good order of our actual citizenship that are just horrifying. I mean, there's no other word for it. And the world, this cascading series of horrifying things, and you feel your actual citizenship as a very troubling condition, one that needs to be objected to as much as anything. And what we're seeing, I think, in all of the places that we live as a consequence of this, or a trigger for this, is the rise of a certain kind of aggressive nationalism that's becoming the explanation for bad things on so many fronts. And we're left in this pool of distress, a global network of concerned small L liberals. And digital citizenship, the obligations of digital citizenship, to me at the moment can't be separated from the obligations of passport citizenship. They're troubling one another in certain ways. So that's why I suggested that these are really very urgent times for citizenship as itself, as well as citizenship as a metaphor for something else. That was my thought.
What do you think about the fact that because we can shape our digital, because nobody's telling us or speaking in our name yet, is there where some of that power lies, or is that where it gets dangerous? I'm just curious.
For me, the
okay.
idea that we can shape our digital citizenship is important and also very limited, in that the shaping of digital citizenship is just as rough-edged, just as often bitter, and as brutal. And you would think, we would think, filter bubble, we would think we come to the digital and this is where everybody agrees that the wrong things are wrong and the right things are right. But that's not actually what's happening in the digital. So there also needs, we come to the digital with a particular position that needs to translate into a particular kind of advocacy or activism, whatever. And I think the digital is also now becoming really charged with the troubles of the actual citizenship that we hold. So I want to believe that it's like that, Sandy, but I don't feel at the moment that I'm sure that it is. And so for me, this is really powerfully a question of responsibility. Where am I responsible to speak? Where am I responsible to be quiet? Events in the United States are not in my citizenship space. I can express horror, but what is an indignant Australian way offshore in another hemisphere in another season expressing horror about things? What is that? And in reverse, what do I do about the horrifying things here, speaking them into, as it were, your citizenship? So I don't think it's as straightforward as one being the compensatory alternative to the other, is my thought.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm always reluctant to speak, but I think Sunday, kind of in response to what you asked and what Kate said, and I hate to keep hammering this, but one of the things that strikes me is kind of the way, that in the digital or otherwise, right? Like our ability to name ourselves and operate as citizens relies so much on the power of other people, right? If we take into account, or if we think about just the recent events, right, with the man who was killed by police, the most recent one, like his girlfriend streamed the events live on Facebook, right? Well, I don't know how many people caught this, but initially Facebook took that down, and they named it as an algorithmic issue, right? Like, oh, and put it up. I'm suspicious of that, but right, but we always have to be. I'm suspicious of that explanation anyway. But we always have to be conscious, I think, of the ways that our power sort of can. I don't like to say it like this, but our power can be taken away by things that we don't control, right? Our ability to navigate our citizenship, digital or otherwise, isn't always up to us, right? And the degree to which we sort of demand accountability really makes a big difference in how that how we're able to experience it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, we don't have a lot of control when we're dealing with environments that are not owned by the people, right? But are owned by corporations. And they can kind of choose to do whatever they want with them. So they can choose to take specific content down. They can choose to change the tool, to change the what you see on a regular basis. I think about earlier this year when there was this hopefully misconception that Twitter would be switching to an algorithmic feed, which they're already doing, but they're doing it in little snippets instead of a timeline-based feed. And do we? I mean, there really isn't. I mean, we can yell about it. We can say but I mean, especially with these free tools, that's kind of the paradox of it. Like on one side, it's opening boundaries and allowing us to communicate with one another because these are free and open tools, but on the other side, do we have any real agency in them if we don't have any ownership of them?
Well, and the other sort of angle that I kind of want to bring up is that in this digitally literate world, or this digital world, there's whole segments of the population that just aren't able to contribute or cannot contribute, right? They don't have the tool set to contribute. They don't know how to write into these different tools or use these different tools, or have the financial ability to get on the internet even. And so I think in some ways the digital world is global, but it's also still very selective.
Privileged.
Privileged, yeah.
Yeah, I want to be very careful when I say this because I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to diminish my students at all, but kind of inspired by what Rebecca and Autumn have shown me. I tried this semester in my online classes to meet with all my students through some kind of video chat, right? Whether Google Hangout or Skype or whatever. And the number of people who still don't have that down, right? Who, just either through inexperience or lack of workable technology or not reliable internet connection, even this thing that we often take for granted, right? Well, I'm just going to hop on and have a chat with people from around the world, right? Like, that is not. There are, to mirror what Rebecca said, right? There are huge segments. I mean, this is anecdotal, but I'm sure it goes beyond just my students, right? There are huge segments of the population for whom this kind of thing is not readily available in the same way it is for us.
Well, and even within the privileged populations, it's interesting because I just came back from a conference, an international conference on phenomenology, and so these were all, academics, and from most of them were, full professor type, been around for quite a while in the academy, and they still didn't grasp what it meant to be online, or like what it meant to have a digital presence, or the fact that the digital presence, they still see it as an other, right? Separating the digital from the individual and not seeing, so your digital you is different than your real you. And I thought that was sort of a very interesting, very old way of thinking, I guess. Old as in I thought we got over that a while ago. I think that there's still a long way to go with a lot of people to get them to the point where they can actually be digital citizens. So I think there's, I guess, still a lot of work in digital literacy.
That's why I don't like the term in real life or IRL, because I think it's a misconception that the virtual life isn't real, right? Those are real people behind those screens. Those are real people behind those tweets. Those are real people behind those posts. And I think it does two things simultaneously. I think it's a misconception, and it for the person who's consuming, it kind of creates this misconception that those people aren't real, but it also creates kind of a type of lack of responsibility for putting content out there yourself and for creating yourself on the web, right? Like, oh, I'm not really creating me, I'm creating some fake virtual version of me. You're not, you're creating you. And I don't think people get that, and so I think that creates a lack of responsibility, and yeah, I don't think that's good.
So, Autumn, if I could follow up, do you mean that so people doing things like creating screen names and persona and so on, I'm not sure this is where you were going with it, so that's why I'm asking. So people who are like so into RPG that, and here I'm thinking of relatives who are gamers, so I can bring it really close to home. I've got two who live in Sacramento, right, and they're so into it that I hardly ever see them in person, but they're 3 hours away, right? And so the one who's totally into it definitely has screen persona that isn't the persona that I encounter when we see each other in person a couple of times a year, right? So is that persona them, or is that a piece of them? or is it someone that they've deliberately created who is a not them for their own growth and experimentation and so on?
So I think that's a great fracturing of the idea, right? So what is, and this goes back to the I don't know if anybody caught this, I think Sundi was on this thread, the authentic self. What does it mean to be authentic, right?
Yeah.
And can you have an avatar that you've created that's a representation of a part of yourself, but you're not using your real name, you're not using your real avatar? I guess all I would say, I'd say I don't know. The authenticity question fractures in my mind, like it just explodes in my mind when I start thinking of it philosophically. Like the authenticity thing kind of just like spider webs on me. So I really don't know. What I do is I point back to Kate's point about that. What responsibilities do we have to speak? What responsibilities do we have to be quiet? And I'd say even if you're using an avatar that's not, necessarily like your legal name and your legal representation of who you are, you still have those responsibilities either way, because I think that creating that avatar also opens up because maybe you have a responsibility to speak, right? But you can't for whatever reason in your in the identity that is your legal name and your legal face and all of those kind of things. Maybe you need to create an avatar so that you can have that voice, so that you can fill that responsibility. I'm not sure. Just some thoughts.
Well, and I think some of that goes back to just even we jump back into sort of the safety thing, because I do a lot of stuff in my areas more digital health literacy, and I look at people that blog through cancer. They're not necessarily, especially if they're young people, in a position to be their own name, because anybody who's been diagnosed with cancer and comes out about it on the internet all of a sudden becomes a lot less employable. And their employment options, they're already financially disadvantaged, and their employment options just tank the minute that becomes general public knowledge. And so there's a whole safety issue around whether you can do that, but that does not abdicate your responsibility to be, a nice person online, or, it doesn't give you a right to bully people or any of that stuff, right? Like you still have that responsibility to, I guess, be civil, despite not using your real name. But I would say again that real name, that aliased identity is just as much you as the identity with the name that your parents gave you.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that came up during the authenticity part of the chat was and people were talking about, judging somebody's authenticity, and somebody brought it back to, actually, it's whatever you feel is authentic. So it's actually, how you perceive it for yourself, not necessarily you perceiving other people. I don't know, that made it make more sense to me.
I think they were talking about personal, so they were saying, the authenticity becomes a personal thing, not necessarily a collective thing, which was helpful to me too when I got to that definition.
So who's deciding? So I guess it's kind of the who's deciding aspect of it. So if it's personal, you're deciding if you're authentic or not, and it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily factor in your interactions with others. And again, I'm ending it as a question, because that's kind of what I heard with the addition of the personal and the authentic.
I think for me, listening to this, one thing I think we shouldn't do is assume that this is the first time we've navigated multiple selves. I think the experience that we're tremendously familiar with, for example, is the fracture. Autumn, that's such a lovely way of looking at it. The fracture between our personal selves and our work selves. Which is the more authentic? We typically dress differently, we speak differently, we feel the pressure of constraints on our speech. People who know us in one realm might not recognize us in the other. might be surprised to find out how we are in the other. Colleagues who visit us at home might be surprised by the, state of the bookshelf, for example. And I think we're used to that. But although that is also an area in which large corporations, and universities are large corporations, are starting to impose the responsibilities of citizenship on their employees. So constraining public speech, asking for a certain kind of loyalty to some sort of consensual whole. And so I think as individuals, the pressure and the problems of trying to craft an authentic presence in the world is very complicated because there are so many organizational or institutional impositions being placed on us. And I don't think moving between digital and offline is the first time that we felt that pressure.
When Autumn first brought up the whole in real life and not, and realizing that both are real, I just think about how that journey, it's hard to get there, and you need to have time and be able to check it out, and people get there in different ways. And so that might be a nice bridge for people to, I think that's a really great understanding that maybe this isn't the first time this has happened to you, is a great way to kind of talk about that, because it's a big leap, I find, for people, or, when I try to facilitate that, and maybe it's not as big as I think it is, but there's a lot of space in there that it takes to get to that place, and sometimes people don't have that space and time and play.
And so I'm going to rant just a little bit. That's a part of the problem that I have with, what I've found, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but what I've found to be the, kind of larger conversation about digital citizenship, when I look stuff up about it, like I find that 90% of it is, geared at the K through 12 environment, and it's more about etiquette, and it's more about how to be good, really. Right? What does that mean exactly? What does it mean to be good? And that's why, so Susan had asked me in the chat, people who might watch this later or are watching now won't be able to see this, but she asked me, how am I defining responsibility? And that's a great question, right? So what is your responsibility? To speak up when you see injustice, and but what's your responsibility to yourself to keep yourself safe in a situation like that, like what Rebecca was saying about you need to speak out about your the fact that you have cancer, and that this is your experience, this is what you're going through, because there's other people that might be going through something similar, and that could be helpful to them, but by releasing your real name, are you going to hurt yourself later on down the road? It's very complex.
To me, there's a convergence of two things here, and I'll try to avoid going on a rant, but, in terms of the...
Go for it!
the kid thing, right? Like, we overall have a infantilizing of society, right? That we generally say, we talk about behavior in terms of whether or not kids could experience it, right? So if you have like a marriage discussion, someone will say, well, what should I tell my kids, right? Now, that's stupid in a number of ways, right? But, you should explain life to your kids in the way you see fit, right? But to say that I can't do something, or my partner and I can't do something or whatever, because you don't have the wherewithal to explain it to your child, right, is a pretty messed up way of thinking about how we should operate in the world, right? Or at least I say right. I think so. But the other part of that, right, is that as we lose public space and the idea of the commons, that citizen comes to mean corporate citizen, right? What can you do? What do you do that's good for the company, that's good for where you work, as an employee, how are you good, rather than how are you good in a manner that benefits society. And so the merging of those two things, I think, comes into play in some of the things that we're discussing right now.
I think for me, the question of society, the question of the public, whenever I hear that said, I hear an appeal to a universal standard of the social, the public, that we will all unproblematically agree with. And I think to myself, well, probably in the fairly narrow international circles in which most of us move, those things are roughly common. But that's because we work in relatively small communities. So you and I, Chris, probably have a similar idea of society and a similar idea of the public. And then I think, who are we, whose sense of where the boundary between public and private is different to ours, that we're not taking into account, that it might be very authentic for them to put that boundary in another spot. Not because, I mean, we like to say that people in countries that are different than our own, well, they have repressive regimes, so what can you expect? But there may be other places that authentically, genuinely think very differently. And so whenever we take the conversation to that point, I wonder whose norms are being propagated. Possibly our own, because they're similar. So it gets back to the question that we were asking a moment ago about citizenship and the technical affordances of even being able to be online. What other kinds of non-shared baselines are affecting the way that we think the norms in this conversation ought to be? And I find that a troubling question, because it's not one in which I genuinely have any expertise at all. I just have a hunch that usually when we bring everyone in the tent, that means we're leaving more people out. That's just a hunch. It's not disagreeing with you at all, Chris, about the principles that you're putting forward there, because I agree very strongly with you about the specific illustration that you gave. But I think, to give a concrete example, here, when students write in society, I always say to them, which society do you mean at this point? Because typically and weirdly, they mean a universal norm of society that they're getting from American television. So actually, they mean someone else's society altogether. And I wonder if we do the same thing.
In many ways, I feel that universal, as close as I could get to it, what that inspires in me is helps me to say that intersection, Kate, that you're speaking of the private versus public, and the boundaries that are the normative boundaries at play, it makes me want to unpack that for myself, or it makes me want to encourage others to consider what are those for yourself, as being sort of that inherent educator. What would help us to all operate? If I were to say what I would love a universal to be, or some kind of what does it take to be a digital citizen? Perhaps it does take asking yourself as an individual what that is, and then in the collective, recognizing that is what is at play, and that we often won't know what that is at play. That becomes a universal sort of or a hope that I have for a stance that we can begin to take, and maybe begin to get to that. What I've been hunting for is a collective responsibility. Again, the word is problematic, right? But what I think about, what can I do with my privilege? What kind of modeling can I have? You just hit on getting into the details of what that could be in that fractal.
I was thinking, I think this is a tangent, but it might be a rant. I was thinking yesterday, I was watching the story of a woman in a displaced family. And for me, this is why the citizenship conversation is immensely complicated at the moment, that we're seeing these huge public movements of people who've lost all hope of privacy because they've lost citizenship and they've lost their homes and they're in boats, and it's, you know, they seem to have forfeited everything that we take for granted in terms of the ability to withdraw from the public gaze. But I was watching a woman explain that Eid, the festival that ends Ramadan, was meaningless to her because the purpose of Eid is to be with your family in your home, and that's what you celebrate. And if you're a displaced person and you're in a camp, this is nothing, you know. And I was thinking, well, actually, the meaning of fasting becomes very complicated if you're always starving. And to me, this idea that the norms, she was trying to explain that the norms that she had taken for granted culturally all her life had vanished from her context. And so this transition, which some earnest reporter was trying to sort of get her to speak about, this transition had also been rendered incoherent and illegible by her circumstances. And I think when we speak about citizenship and collective responsibility in this metaphorical way, we speak as people who, for a moment, can't imagine losing the grounds on which we stand. We just can't, it won't happen to us. There are things that we might choose to do, but we won't be violently displaced. And I'm finding the conversation about citizenship, and even more so the conversation about visitors and residents in a digital sense, extraordinarily difficult to go along with at the moment, because citizenship is now just contracting to the privilege of a smaller number of people. And so the idea of the collective has become tremendously unsettled for me. I think that's a tangential rant. I think it's both things.
Well, Kate, I think it's actually kind of brings us full circle, right? I went. Unfortunately, I'm in a situation where you can't see what I'm wearing, right? But I wore this shirt around today, and essentially it is a list of names of men who've been killed by either police or racist violence. And I wore this to well, okay, I'll just say for what it is. I was in a sort of posh suburb of Detroit today, and and the barista asked me what my shirt meant, and I said, "Oh, well, it's a list of names of people who've been killed by police violence." And the look on his face, right? I can't. There's no way to explain it, right? And so I looked at the woman next to him and I said, well, he asked, you know. And I think when we talk about things like this, right, there's always the suffix of for whom, right? And I do. I mean, you know, George has got his avatar is someone of a hoodie, right? I feel like I could be violently displaced every time I leave the house, to be honest. And you know, so I don't think it's a tangent at all, because I think it brings us full circle to what to how you started, right? That it's a really, you know, not that it always hasn't been, but it's a really complex time to think about these questions, whether online or otherwise, because that notion of society and citizen and culture is some ways being atomized, right? Like and people are pulling apart or segregating or being segregated in ways that we like to think we are moving away from, rather than perpetuating, right? So yeah, to say it again, I think it's all. I think it's very relevant to how we started.
I wonder if I could just quickly respond to Chris. When events in the United States, you know, these recent terrible killings, so they're in my timeline. I'm watching people die. I'm kind of in the store. I'm watching someone die on my phone. in another country, but not another country, as Chris points out, not another country that keeps all of its citizens safe in the same way at all. And in my timeline, there are people saying, white people, shut up. And in my timeline, there are people saying, white people, where are you? Why are you not speaking? And I'm standing in the store, and this question of responsibility that this conversation has asked me to think about ahead of this moment is pressing on me. I'm in the store, and I'm thinking, what is my responsibility to express my horror at this in human terms? You know, I'm a mum. There was a kid in that car. You know, and I think that the digital has brought things to us in a whole new way in terms of the responsibility to respond. And I didn't, in that moment, rooted to the kind of tiles of the store, I'm thinking, I don't know what to do other than gaze helplessly at my fellow citizens in this country who've got no idea what I'm looking at, to say, what is the we here? Are we in that we? Are we observers of that we? And that evening, these events played out on our mainstream media news, and they were played out as things happening in America. You know, we watch America from a distance. So I'm watching America, and instantly, I don't know, I just felt a tremendous anxiety about Chris. I just thought, Chris is a person in my network. Chris is a person that I now don't want to go outdoors. You know, stay home. You know, because this seems such a profoundly unsafe situation. So Chris will know, you know, I reached out to him kind of just, And I think this is the mess that we're in at the moment with networks, that networks become intensely personal at times of crisis, that I felt so incapable of knowing where to speak and when to be silent, to meet the obligations and expectations placed upon me by my network. But I also knew that I was really concerned about a particular person in a vague, anxious way. And that, Chris, I think that is my kind of response is, what are we to each other as persons in this situation? When I watch someone die on my phone in the store, I feel like I want everything to stop. I want us to honour that horror by not going about our business. And I'm not quite sure what to do with all of that.
It's a lot.
Yeah, sorry. That is a lot. But it's very pressing, this digital citizenship thing, because this is the digital, that you are at the store and this is on your phone. This is the digital. It's
very isolating in a lot of ways, right? I mean, you're standing there, it's kind of like you're alone in a room full of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And you watch the mobilization of solidarities around it, solidarities to which you don't belong. You know, you think, do I appear complicit with this because I'm silent? But I'm silent in horror. And on the digital, when you're silent, you're not there at all. Whereas if I was on the street, I could be silent because I could be silently present. But in the digital, I have to speak for anybody to know that I've even noticed that this has happened. And if I have to speak for people to know that I know that this has happened, immediately I have to think, what do I say? How do I do anything other than appear to be just kind of drawing attention to myself, my horror? And I think for me, that's one of the hardest things about digital citizenship, is that I want some way of showing up in silence. And I don't know what that way is.
And the larger your network is, and the more personal connections you have like that, then those moments happen more often. Like, I even see it now for myself, getting more connected. I feel overwhelmed with how many times I feel that way now, because if we did have that moment of silence for everything that needs that moment of silence, we would have silence at this point, right? Like, there is a lot happening in this world. And the more you're connected and you know about it, then I think those questions become harder, and yeah.
Yeah, to extend this a bit to a national or international perspective, I mean, with some of the recent terror attacks, right? People are saying, well, why isn't Facebook doing X for the bombings in Turkey? You know, why aren't people changing their avatars to the Turkish flag or this or that, right? In the same way they did the French, right? And again, so we are, and that is a way kind of showing up in silence, right? But it's, again, we're expecting companies, right? We're expecting conglomerates and companies to enable us in ways that they're not really up to the task, right? And I don't know the answer to that. You know, another thing that I've been thinking about today, right, is the extent to which I want a closed network, because I don't really want to hear from anybody who looks to defend these things. And so the degree to which I'm sort of walled off or bubbled, you know, on days like today, I think that's great, right? Or in a election year like this one, I think it's great, because I don't really have anything to say to most of those people. And, you know, and I don't like to use even that language to say those people, but you know, I'm getting kind of pushed to those to that extreme, right? Because not the extreme right, but to that extreme, yes. Because the level of shared, you know, even an understanding of sort of what a common good might mean, or what it means to be a person or a citizen or a human being, you know, there doesn't seem to be a lot of crossover, right? So even in an effort, like in the interest of safety, I'd rather them not be in my network.
So, to Kate's point, I think it's one of the challenges of allyship, unless you've got a better word for it, to be both silent and not silent. It's obviously a challenge online, and it's something you can do in person. In a tragedy, you can go and you can be there. You know, there's a physical, as you described, whether it's being with, you know, a friend, or being just in the next room when a friend is having something tragic going on, and even with professional colleagues, being in the next office or down the hall or whatever, and they know that you're there. Those are all things you can do that have a physical manifestation, but there doesn't seem to be an equivalent online for that, because if you're silent and staying out of the way because you don't know what to say, or you can put your foot in it, or whatever, you know, or whatever wonderful support you can give still seems trite at certain times. All of those things apply, and yet saying nothing does sort of seem like, oh, you're not connected, you're not there, you must be taking the day or the week off, and you know, you're out camping and didn't tell anyone, you know, and maybe you don't even know that the last 2 or 3 days of tragedies in the U.S. had occurred, right? And that's why you're not saying anything, because surely Kate would be saying something had she but known. That's the challenge of allyship, and it's not, you know, obviously not just about that. It's about anything we care to name, you know. And I have to say that when you were speaking, I actually thought of Gamergate, you know, and all the mansplaining guy things that I chose not to say during Gamergate. I thought, let me just shut up. And so I did. So I was a non-presence at the height of all of that, essentially. Not that I wasn't online, but I was kind of a non-presence for that, even though I would otherwise say, oh, I'm not a bad ally. That wasn't one of the times. So that's, a different kind of an example where I didn't have the term, higher ed or adult level digital citizenship to play with at the time. But now I'm thinking, oh, I wasn't a very good digital citizen, during that period. But this week, I sure would like to see a bunch of white people being good digital citizens, whatever that means, and not necessarily being silent, right? Silence is a problem when it's not supportive silence, and we don't know it's supportive silence online.
George, can I just respond to that? I mean, that's enormously helpful to hear. I want to add the dimension of international to this. One of the complications of digital citizenship, I think, is that it brings us all together as though actual citizenship isn't a thing. And I was thinking this when Mike Caulfield's avatar banner, Disarm Hate, suddenly became was very widely distributed after the Orlando shootings, which was a sort of similar call, I think, on all of us to speak. And I was thinking, well, it's very complicated for an Australian to make that change because we are in a completely different gun culture, completely different. So to whom would I address that instruction, disarm hate? I would be addressing it to a foreign government in the way that I might with Turkey or Iraq. I'd be saying to the US, well, you guys should disarm yourselves in that way. And so allyship, I think, is thrown into a further state of trouble by not knowing to what extent, when it's something like state power, to what extent what I have to say is relevant at all. When it came down to it, and my experience of this the other way is that having been a death penalty activist through a particular case that really affected Australia, I was also aware that other people couldn't show up for that. They couldn't be, the people in my network who are American, also a death penalty nation, couldn't show up for this particular case in the way that Australians could show up for it because they carried no weight with our government at all. And as it turned out, neither did we. The conclusion that I came to when I finally moved in the store was that what I did understand was that in the world of people in my timeline who are really dear to me, this would be far and away more traumatizing than it was to me. How traumatizing it was to me would be multiplied by a number that I couldn't come up with. And that was my obligation as an ally, was to try to speak within those particular relationships. But you have made me think, George, that there is a sort of another level of obligation, even if it's another country and kind of not your business at some level politically, to say, at a human level, this is just so bad that the boundaries of citizenship, actual citizenship, are not relevant. But as an activist, I struggle with that idea because I know that we only lobby our own state. So I'm thinking through the difference between activism and allyship. They're sort of. This is a very complex conversation. I'm so grateful to all of you for the opportunity to think about these really, really difficult things. We've moved so far from the K-12 be a good citizen conversation, to the really, really dark, messy aspects of this. And I'm so profoundly grateful to all of you for this.
I'm really grateful as well, and it's one of the things that I struggle with in thinking about, teaching this, because that's one of the things that that's one of the reasons why I want to have this conversation is because I'm teaching a first-year seminar on digital citizenship in the fall. And I was just talking with another faculty member today about how do I have that conversation, and maybe it's the Cynefin framework, I'm not sure, but how do I basically put the foundation right up front with students that we're going to dive into some stuff that we're not going to find answers for, right? And that's okay, because the conversation is so important. Like, we need to have the conversation, but it's not going to be like, here's the solution. And I think especially for first-year students, that might be hard for them. They want easy answers, right? I paid for this class. You tell me what box to check off, right?
It's almost like giving them the words to talk about it, or the frameworks, or the yeah. I mean, for myself too, I am learning the words to talk about it. I'm writing them down right now, even from this conversation, right? And I'm sorry. Again, the conversation doesn't have to stop, but I have to stop the broadcast. I apologize, folks. So I'm going to stop it, and then I hope you continue your conversation if you would like to. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sunday. That's great. Thank you so much.